Welcome back to the morning show here on the Rise News. It's now time to take a look at news stories making headlines around the globe. We'll begin here in Nigeria, where the Chief of Staff to the President Muhammadu Buhari, Abba Kyari, who tested positive for coronavirus, has arrived Lagos and currently undergoing preventive treatment on the advice of his doctors. The top presidential aide, who was flown to Lagos in an air ambulance, was in high spirits and was not showing any symptoms associated with the virus. Mr. Kyari had, in a statement on Sunday night, disclosed that on the advice of his doctors, he would be transferred to Lagos for further tests and observation as a precautionary measure. He also said he felt well and had observed all laid down protocols on the disease. He then disclosed that he had been working from home and expressed hope to return to work soon. Dr. Abati, well, news had been rife about the whereabouts of the Chief of Staff to Mr. President. Some insinuated he had been flown out of the country to get better care, but this statement by Mr. Kyari yesterday hopefully douses and, convinces everyone that he's here and he's coming to Lagos for that treatment. He's talking about resuming to work very soon, showing that he's in high spirits. Another thing to pick up from Mr. Kyari's situation is that you might not show symptoms for this disease. You're asymptomatic, but you can be infectious because you might be positive. So it is very important to tell people again that you might not come down with all the symptoms. Stay at home because you do not know.
Well, I think, this is an interesting development, and our prayers are with Malam Abba Kyari, a man that I know very well. He's a gentleman. He's a very competent man, well-educated. Once upon a time, a journalist. Once upon a time, a banker. And he's been called to service at a very high level to serve President Muhammadu Buhari as Chief of Staff. And I think so far he has handled the situation with a lot of, leadership. And what I find interesting in the statement that he issued is that he said, look, this disease does not recognize any difference between a big man and a small man, between the north and the south, between men or women, or between the rich or the poor. Indeed. And he ended his statement by saying that we are all in this together. So, which means that we're all in this together, truly, as he has pointed out. And the fact that he has followed the necessary protocol after he tested positive and he was declared asymptomatic, he decided to follow the protocol. He has self-isolated, and now he has chosen the option of submitting himself for further tests and treatment in Lagos. Lagos seems to have the best facilities, particularly with the donation of a 110-bed facility by GT Bank. Lagos seems to be better prepared than other states of the Federation. But two questions will be raised. The Chief of Staff had to leave Abuja to come to Lagos for further tests and treatment and observation. Does it mean that the health infrastructure that is in Abuja, the seat of government, is inadequate? We've been told that, there's an isolation center in Abuja at the University of Abuja Teaching Hospital, and also at another location at Gwagwalada, right? For the Chief of Staff to leave Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory, and come to Lagos means perhaps that, there's better effort, better facilities in Lagos. And I think that, government should take a look at that and try to see how, the facilities in Abuja can also be further scaled up so that we don't overstretch Lagos. The president has declared a 10 billion naira support for Lagos State, but that's not enough. We should have other centers of excellence where we can deal with this particular issue, particularly now that we know that coronavirus is not going to disappear in 1 month. In the UK, they are preparing for a 6-month stretch. Now, is Nigeria ready for a 6-month stretch? But it is good that the president addressed the country yesterday. That in itself is an indication that Nigeria is in a better place in terms of leadership, in terms of response, and that, at the highest level, this is being taken very seriously. Indeed.
Before we go into the president's speech, I think another noble thing in Mr. Kyari's statement was that he says he wants to pay for his treatment not to overburden the already burdened state resources, and he was willing to pay out of pocket for whatever treatment he gets.
That's not a problem. He can't afford it. He's been a bank director. He's been everything in his lifetime. And of course, you know that ministers of the Federal Republic, 43 of them, have said, you know, they are going to take a 50% pay cut to make a contribution. And many individuals have been contributing, including Atiku Abubakar, Segun Agbaje, Jim Ovia, you know, Aliko Dangote, and so many other personalities, Femi Otedola, you know, all of these persons have been making contributions. And Aliko Dangote is leading a coalition of the private sector to engage this war against coronavirus. So if the chief of staff says he will pay, it's not a problem at all. In fact, he should go beyond paying and further make a contribution, because I think he can afford it.
Okay.
But we wish him well.
Yes, we do.
You know, and
quick recovery.
Fortunately for us at this point, many of the cases in Nigeria, you know, are mild cases, mild symptoms. We don't have severe cases, and that's why we've recorded only one death. But we'll continue to pray for the affected and wish all of them well.
All of them, indeed. Now let's go to that president's speech you mentioned earlier, Dr. Bati. President Muhammadu Buhari announced an initial 14-day lockdown in Lagos, Ogun, and the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, as part of precautionary measures to contain further spread of the coronavirus. The lockdown announced by the president is expected to begin 11 p.m. today. The news comes as the latest number of confirmed cases in the country rises to 111.
The first signs that coronavirus or COVID-19 was turning into an epidemic and was officially declared a worldwide emergency, the federal government started planning preventive, containment, and curative measures in the event the disease hits Nigeria. The whole instruments of government are now mobilized to confront what has now become both a health emergency and an economic crisis. In Nigeria, we are taking a two-step approach. First, to protect the lives of our fellow Nigerians and residents living here, and second, to preserve the livelihoods of workers and business owners to ensure their families get through this very difficult time in dignity and with hope and peace of mind. To date,
Dr. Abati, we'll go on a break very soon, but we'll come back to discuss some more about this because it's very important. Better late than never, or finally, at last. I can imagine the headlines on front pages of newspapers today, but let's go on that break. And we're back to talk about the president's speech yesterday. Join us again. Welcome back to the Morning Show here on the Rise News. And Dr. Abati, the president's speech yesterday may not have come as timely as a lot of people wanted it, but my personal opinion, I think he touched on the most critical parts on how Nigeria can contain and, you know, flatten this curve of the coronavirus. What's your take?
Well, first, let's look at the issue of perception. Before the president made that speech yesterday, there had been a lot of speculation. First, about his health status. Second, about his whereabouts. Third, about his commitment to the coronavirus pandemic. And I think that, you know, the strategists, his handlers, responding to public opinion, have been able to, they've made it very clear to the Nigerian public that their president has not gone AWOL, and that the president has been working, and that the president is alive and well and in charge, to borrow a phrase from Alhaji Lai Muhammad when he addressed the press. So the president coming out, you know, reassures us, gives us confidence, and dispels all the rumors, all the speculations, all the conspiracy theories about his personal circumstances. That is one. Two, in terms of the text itself, you know, I think it's a very well-written speech. I mean, during the president's first term, I used to complain about the quality of statements from the presidency, of speeches by the president. In the first time, most of his speeches were very badly written by very incompetent people. But since his second term, we've seen an improvement that has been consistent. And I would like to congratulate whoever made an input into that speech, because it's a very comprehensive speech,
articulated,
simple language, well put together, you know, and it touches every important point. The president, throughout that, statement, which was about 30 minutes or so, about 64 paragraphs, struck all the right notes. And it shows that some intelligent people took a look at it. Now, let's look at the content. In terms of content, I think the content is also satisfactory. I mean, the president talked about sacrifice. He talked about life and death matter. He talked about every Nigerian getting involved in this. He gave us a rundown of what his government has done so far. We may have heard from other people, from the NCDC, from the Ministry of Health, from other stakeholders, the Minister of Information, the task force, you know, but the president put all of that together. He gave a summary, an overview, which I think is commendable. And apart from all the measures that have been taken, it went further. Now, when a president speaks, there must be something from it. There must be something quotable. There must be substance. There must be
a takeaway.
There must be policy options. So this speech, in my view, I don't know what other people think. You know, I don't know what any other person thinks. I'm saying this as somebody who had gone through that route and who had worked on presidential speeches almost on a daily basis. So I think it serves our purpose. And 7 key points. The president talked about the shutdown of Lagos, Abuja, and Ogun State. Now, these are the red zones. Okay, some people have complained that why is it that the president did not talk about Oyo State, which probably has more cases than Ogun State. But when the crisis started on February 27, the places that have been mostly indicated are Lagos, Ogun, and the Federal Capital Territory. He talked about stipend for the most vulnerable, where he didn't quite give enough details in this regard. But I think this is something that many Nigerians have been asking for, stipend. Now, I hope that they will work out the details. He talked about 2-month food supply for internally displaced persons. I think that is also important because he said, look, we have a 2-pronged approach, right? To protect the people and also to help them.
Economies,
yes, and preserve the economy, 2-pronged approach. He talked about the suspension of loan repayments to the federal government, trader money, farmer money, you know, and all
market
trader money, whatever.
Yes.
You know, that, look, there will be a moratorium on all of this. And I think that shows empathy, that shows concern. He talked about converting federal government stadia across the country into isolation centers. Now, I think that's also a good move. Now, he talked about the suspension of movement by commercial jets. Now, they have done that previously by closing down all the international airports. And even now, he says even private jets cannot move. So we are all in this together, as Abba Kyari told us in his statement. So it shows that both the poor and the rich cannot move. Nobody can come and carry one funny private jet and be moving up and down
at the expense of everybody,
infecting people all over the place. And then he talked about exemptions. Now, those exemptions relate to journalists, people involved in oil and gas, telecommunication workers, people essentially involved. But then there is a caveat there. He says
you have to be able to prove
that has to be proven.
That you cannot work from home.
Because it will be monitored. You know, you have to prove that you cannot work from home. You know, so all of these measures, I think, as the president's first intervention, are welcome. And we want to expect that President Buhari will continue to take charge. And that those, you know, who advise him will continue to stay on top of it. This should not be his only public communication with Nigerians. Indeed. People have seen gray areas in the speech. You know, they've talked about Oyo State. Why is Oyo State not locked down? They have asked questions about specificity in terms of, you know, stipends and moratorium and all of the other measures. Some people say
the financial institutions, the banks were not mentioned.
Yes.
Are they exempt or are they part of this lockdown?
Yeah, you know, in terms of omissions, I thought the president should have gone a bit further. Whoever wrote that speech should have commended, you know, some of the private individuals. I know there's a paragraph
Yes.
that talked about that, but it was a very short paragraph.
Yes,
because we've seen a lot of support from the private sector. And the private sector needed to be specially commended. Because, I mean, what is clear is that the government of Nigeria also needs the private sector. In fact, if you add up the figures in a statement released by the Federal Ministry of Finance, by the Permanent Secretary, you see that the private sector has even donated more money to this crisis than the government of Nigeria. You know, I would like the president, maybe in a subsequent address, you know, to specially commend those persons.
Like he did for the DG of the NCDC?
But I like the fact, yes, he singled out the Director General of the NCDC, Chikwe Iwekazu, who attended a meeting of the WHO in China. And also, he commended the Federal Ministry of Health. I think that's perfectly in order. As I said, it's a very well-written speech. I cannot, you know, fault it.
Yes, I totally agree with you, especially because the president identified the task force led by the SGF, the Secretary of Government of Federation, as the coordinating body for all these monies and spending. So he could have, you know, gone a step further to be specific about these private sector individuals or the private sector who is making that donation for the, you know, the coordinating body to spend.
Well, you just reminded me of something. I think one other omission in that speech is that I object to the idea of the president saying donations should be centralized. I thought I had something like that.
Yeah.
But what we have seen is that many of these people in the private sector or individuals like Tubaba,
Two-Face
Idibia, that's his real name, but they also call him Tubaba.
Yes.
Who have made donations.
10 million naira.
Yeah, he contributed 10 million naira. You know, people don't have necessarily to contribute to give money to the federal government. Yeah. Some persons may choose, because they are from a particular state, to say, I will support my state. So this over-centralization of everything, I think it's not quite right. Okay. You know, the federal government should not dictate that if you want to contribute, you must contribute to the presidential task force.
Perhaps for better transparency of the spendings, like some people have started to, you know, insinuate. Serap, for instance, is asking already for the Ministry of Finance to show the spendings of this money monthly, weekly. So maybe perhaps to create, you know, that transparency for the spendings.
Yes, accountability is important, but I think that the Federal Ministry of Finance has already taken a step by publishing a statement in which, you know, the ministry listed all the donations from Femi Otedola, Jimovia, Abdusamad Rabiu, Aliko Dangote, one guy called Akaniye, Tubaba, you know, all of that, you know, has been listed. But you are right, accountability. They should tell us how the money is spent. And it's not just the federal government, also at the state level. But what is important is how we can combat this, how we can keep Nigeria safe, and how we can continue to observe social distancing, because the president also cited that as something that is important.
Very important.
You know, so all is well that ends well. As you said earlier, better late
than never. Indeed. Let's quickly go to the U.S., where President Trump is extending the voluntary national shutdown for a month as sickness and death from the coronavirus pandemic rises in the country. The initial 15-day period of social distancing urged by the federal government was due to expire today. President Trump had expressed interest in relaxing the national guidelines, at least in parts of the country less affected by the pandemic. But instead, he decided to extend them through April 30, a tacit acknowledgement he had been too optimistic about. Many states and local governments have safer controls in place on mobility and gatherings. President Trump's impulse to restore normalcy met a sober reality check yesterday from Dr. Anthony Fauci, the government's top infectious disease expert, who said the U.S. could experience more than 100,000 deaths and millions of infections from the pandemic.
I want the American people to know that your selfless, inspiring, and valiant efforts are saving countless lives. You are making the difference. The modeling estimates that the peak in death rate is likely to hit in 2 weeks.
So yes, we feel that the mitigation that we're doing right now is having an effect. It's very difficult to quantitate it because you have two dynamic things going on at the same time. You have the virus going up and you have the mitigation trying to push it down. But the decision to prolong, not prolong, but to extend.
We'll go on a break now. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. It's time to look at some of those business stories making the headlines at this time. Arise business analyst Rochus Odiri joins us now. Good morning, Rochus.
Good morning, Liswa. Good morning, Dr. Abati. So, have you guys seen oil prices this morning? Before we get to oil prices, it's quite scary. The lockdown, you've already discussed the lockdown announcement from the president. But what I was looking at was the effects on businesses, right? That is cash-based businesses and how long they can sustain themselves over the next 14 days. We don't know, like we were talking about yesterday on the panel, the global briefing on Arise News, where we looked at the coronavirus effects. If this extension of a lockdown, if it happens, if there's an extension past 14 days, how will they survive? Also, should financial services be considered essential, right? Of course, President Buharis said the medical services, he mentioned the discos, the gencos, security services, food, and so on. But because, we don't know how long certain folks can do without cash. I understand most of us operate in a cashless society, but there's still many people on the outskirts of Lagos, on the outskirts of Ogun, and some even Abuja that still are very cash-based. So one just simply has to look at what the effect will be if within this 2-week period they are not able to clamp down on the possible surge that Professor Abayomi, the Lagos State Commissioner of Health, was talking about, and what will be the impact of businesses if you have a 3-week lockdown or 4 weeks and so on. So it's something that folks have to really look at with regards to how they will possibly carry on.
Well, I think the way out of this is to learn lessons from other jurisdictions. If you look at the United States announced a lockdown of a 15-day period, but President Trump has had to revise his position. The fear is that, look, if the United States does not take drastic steps, the numbers could go from 100,000 to about 2 million cases.
Right.
And both the president and Anthony Fauci, the top infectious disease specialist, they seem to be getting closer now in terms of their thoughts. President Trump had boasted that by April 12th, there will be no problem anymore in the United States, but he has revised his position. In Australia, Scott Morrison has also had to announce additional steps beyond what was announced initially. And you can see also in the UK revising its position as it engages with the reality. So I think that there may have been omissions in the president's speech yesterday, particularly with regard to the banks, because banks also offer essential services.
Yes.
If you are locking down Lagos, Ogun, and the FCT, and you have given us just a gap of how many hours? Less than 24 hours. Then that could create problems. So you are right to say that, look, what will be the impact on business? Yes, businesses generally will suffer, but certain categories of businesses should be included. I think that maybe the president could have made an exemption for financial services.
Right.
How? We can learn the example from the state of Punjab in India. What the state of Punjab in India decided is that on March 30 and 31, all banks should be open, and then they close them down.
Right.
Then from April 3 in Punjab, all banks will open for 2 days per week for people to have access to money. And then beyond that, bank essential staff of banks, will be allowed to go to work. But what all this raises, again, is a question about financial inclusion.
Right.
In Punjab, the directive is that all ATMs must be operational 24 hours, 24/7. Now, are we at that level in Nigeria where all ATMs, ATM machines, will be available? Right. Is it all of us that have electronic banking services? Now, I used to do electronic banking, but when I discovered that this person will ask me for 10,000, that one will ask me for 5,000, and my Christian mind would keep allowing me. At the end of the month, when you check it, you will see that you are in trouble. So I opted out of it. So I'm in a dilemma now. How do I survive at this time? So maybe this will teach all of us a lesson,
right?
To get involved in this electronic banking business. But maybe when the president gives his second address, after a review of these 2 weeks shutdown of the red zones, maybe he will come forward and say, okay, banks are allowed to open for 2 days, or banks should take steps to make sure that they ramp up their electronic banking services, and the CBN insists more on financial inclusion.
And the other aspect for me is the effect on businesses is the informal sector. You talked about the Arise special yesterday, the global outlook at the pandemic, and we had Atedo Peterside, the founder of Stanbic IBTC, who says, there's a lot of stimulus coming, but this is for the corporate, this is for the big businesses. Nobody is looking so much at the informal sector, the people who live, from hand to mouth every day, especially in these cities that we're now locking down.
Exactly.
Well, how that was addressed in the UK is as follows. Chancellor Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the government of the United Kingdom, announced a special package of £3 million a month for the self-employed, hairdressers, cab drivers, people who, if they do not go out on a daily basis, will be vulnerable. Now, many Nigerians had asked for that, and some Nigerians had even gone ahead to say we have 40 million Nigerians on bank verification numbers, that you can reach very easily. But the government denied that they do not have such a plan. It may get to a point where the government would need to worry about the self-employed, people who live from hand to mouth on a daily basis. Already, the CBN, Godwin Emefiele, the governor of the central bank, had announced access to about 3 million for households. But we don't know what the modalities are. And many Nigerians in rural areas, can they ever have access to that package that has been announced by the central bank?
Although he did say you have to show that you've been adversely affected by coronavirus in order to have access to it.
We are all adversely
affected. Speaking of adverse effects, the Minister of Finance recently said that Nigeria could possibly enter a recession in the next 6 months if the coronavirus effects do not abate. I looked at her comments and I was like, it shouldn't really be focusing on the coronavirus, because the coronavirus could end tomorrow. Nigeria would still be in trouble because of oil prices. Oil prices, the hits there at, I believe, Brent crude right now is about $26 a barrel. Our own derivative that we sell, Bonnie Light, that I think is about 22. So our oil prices are really alarmingly low. And if Russia and Saudi Arabia continue this oil price war that they're doing, Saudi Arabia announced that April 1st, they are going to be crashing oil prices. They're going to not crashing oil prices. They're going to be flooding the markets with more oil. I think Saudi Arabia is doing about 10 million barrels per day. They are going to push it to 12. I believe the UAE also said they're going to flood the markets as well. So April is looking like a very, very troubling period for Nigeria with regards to oil prices, and I'm sure the Minister, Minister of Finance, Zainab Ahmed, knows about that as well. So I wouldn't have limited the comments only to the effects of the coronavirus. Now it's really for us, as far as the revenue we're bringing in, about oil, and so it's the days ahead are looking tough with where oil prices are right now.
But Rochus, each time you brought up this topic before now, what we always say is that, look, this coronavirus pandemic and the crisis in the oil and gas sector is teaching us lessons.
Yes.
One big lesson is the failure of Nigeria, to diversify its economy. We're paying a price for running a monocultural economy. Over the years, everybody has said it, but no government has taken very concrete steps to move beyond easy oil money to diversify the economy and expand the revenue base of the country. Now we're talking about expanding the revenue base. Maybe post-COVID-19, maybe Nigeria will now realize the extent of our vulnerability.
Right.
What all of this has shown us is the extent of our vulnerability. The IMF has said effectively the entire world is already in recession.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, economic analysts in Nigeria have said, look, this year we probably will not get more than 1.3% output growth. in terms of the economy. That's like no growth at all. In a country of 200 million people, where we've been saying that the only thing that can sustain us is double-digit growth.
Yes.
And that's why, as we said yesterday on This Day Live, another program on this channel, that we're not just dealing with coronavirus. We will need post-coronavirus to deal with hunger virus, which is a big problem.
Hunger virus is very real, yes.
Because if growth is going to decline by about 0.5% in the first quarter, by 0.2% in the second quarter, Nigeria could just slip into recession effectively. And then all the macroeconomic indicators are not in our favor. You cited oil price. You cited coronavirus. If you look at the external reserve, it's down. If you look at excess crude account, there is nothing there. If you look at our balance of trade deficit, it is high, almost about $3 billion.
Yes.
And we don't have the buffers. It's good that the CBN and Godwin Emefiele, they are doing the heavy lifting, but they don't have support enough to treat internal and external shocks. So we're really in trouble. And I think that as we deal with the immediate crisis of public health safety, we should also be dealing with the economy, both now and in the aftermath of coronavirus
as well.
I mean, you look at the population and you just fear, even with this lockdown that we have at the moment, we're likely to see population keep increasing and keep decreasing. That's my biggest worry here.
Well, I know some wives have complained to me that this is not a good season at all, because having the husbands at home and available, could be an issue. So you could have population exploding.
Almost 3%. Population growth is almost, and it's higher than GDP. So that's something we have to look at.
We will call those children the coronials.
The
coronials.
Interesting.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, I think this little time.
But what is required is discipline.
Discipline. I mean,
discipline.
Family planning. It has to be taught. It has to be taught across the country. It really does. It really does. Really quickly, I think Dr. Abati already mentioned it. Business Day ran a story saying that the president had approved a 30,000 naira monthly payment to all Nigerians that had BVN, but they retracted it.
That was denied.
It was denied. Yes, it was denied. Femi Adesina, the special advisor on media and publicity, came out and said that it wasn't true. But in effect, that would have mirrored the stimulus that the US had done if it had become true. But the amount was just too much. 30,000 naira times 40 million Nigerians on BVN would have been 1.2 trillion, which would have been way too much at this point.
We don't have the money.
We don't have it.
And unfortunately, we don't have the time to talk more on this. But thank you so much, Rotus.
Thank you, Rotus.
Thank you.